Hello, friends. We're back of episode 184 of the Our Weekly Highlights podcast. This is the usually weekly podcast where we talk about the great resources that are shared in the highlights section and elsewhere on this week's Our Weekly issue. My name is Eric Nance, and yes, we were off last week because yours truly was knee deep helping with a lot behind the scenes as well as in front of the camera, so to speak, with the virtual Pharma conference, which was, in my humble estimation, a smashing success. I think we had over 2,500 registrants at one point tuning in during the conference days, as well as some really awesome workshops. And you'll be hearing more about those workshops in a little bit in our last highlight. But nonetheless, that's why we were off last week. But I am here this week. Unfortunately, I'm by myself, so to speak, because my truly awesome co-host Mike Thomas is knee deep in his day job projects, trying to get things done, but he looks forward to being back next week with all of you. Nonetheless, I'll hold the fort down for this week, and I got some fun things to talk about and share with our highlights here, which this week's issue has been curated by Bato Almarzak, and as always, she had tremendous help from our fellow RWiki team members and contributors like all of you around the world with your pull requests and other suggestions. Speaking of conferences, I'm happy to announce in our first highlight here that after a couple months of in the editing can, so to speak, the recordings from the 2024 Posit conference have finally landed on Posit's YouTube channel. We knew these were coming soon, but we weren't quite sure when. But this is a terrific way to catch up on what you may have missed if you were not able to attend the conference itself back in August. And if you want to hear more of my take on the event itself, especially from the in-person experience, I invite you to check out our back catalog here where I talked at length about this in episode 174 of our Weekly Highlights. I'll have that linked in the show notes if you want to check that out. But nonetheless, another great benefit of the recordings, even for someone like me who was able to attend, is that it is a multi-track conference, right? And you can't possibly see all the talks that you want because inevitably there will be some that overlap. And especially in the case of when I gave my talk on the power of WebAssembly for the future of Shiny and clinical submissions, which, by the way, I will have directly linked in the show notes. It's great to see the recording back, albeit I haven't watched it yet because even though I edit podcasts and I've been doing podcasting for over, 10 years or whatever, it's hard to listen to watch myself on video, but I will at some point. Nonetheless, when I was giving that presentation, across the hallway, I believe one of the other rooms, was Posit's kind of team presentation on the new Positron IDE. So that's a great one I'm going to be catching up with to see kind of the genesis of that, the comparisons with the RStudio IDE, and it was kind of the coming out party, if you will, even though Positron is still not, quote unquote, in production yet. It was Posit's first crack at really sharing their story behind the development of Positron, and I'll be watching that space quite closely. And there are a lot of, and I do mean a lot of other terrific talks, and I dare say there's something for everyone, whether you're knee-deep in industry, healthcare. Certainly shout out to my friends in life sciences. We had a lot of great talks on the life sciences tracks. Also utilizing automated reporting and things with Quarto, which we'll be hearing about throughout this segment and the rest of the episode. And yeah, for the Shiny enthusiasts, there's a lot here too. I was watching a little bit this weekend when I saw the recordings are up. I rewatched a talk from the designer, so to speak, of the Shiny UX side of things, Greg Swinehart. He gave a terrific talk on the recent advancements in the user interface components of Shiny, both for the R side and the Python side, and lots of great resources that he shared. And he always has a unique style to his talks. I definitely resonate with it. And you would never know the importance of a hex logo until you really watch his talk and how it kicked off a lot of their design efforts for the Shiny user interface function, especially with BSLib. My goodness, have you seen the hex sticker for BSLib? That thing is ace, and I can't wait to get a hard copy of that. Nonetheless, another great talk going back to the Quarto side of things that I wasn't able to see in person was by Andrew Bray, where he talked about the new close read Quarto extension, how the development journey of that began, and it was a close collaboration with another developer named Jeremy. And also, it really brings to light a way that you can get that scrolly telling look that you might see on, say, some data readout or data posts from like the New York Times or other groups that kind of use that technique. Well, if you're writing a Quarto doc, this close reads extension is definitely something worth your time to check out. And speaking of close read, that definitely relates to a little ad hoc addition here. I just learned a few days ago that Posit is now running a close read contest to see what you can build for an engaging either data storytelling, an engaging tutorial, but really seeing what you can do to push close read to new heights. So we'll have a link to that blog post from Posit in the show notes as well. I dare say I've had attempts at doing a scrolly telling kind of presentation before. Ironically, at a very earlier version of what was then the Art Studio conference, when I had a poster session. And of course, a poster session in these days means like an electronic display that you're standing next to and kind of walking through with people as they walk by and answer questions. But my poster session back then was about kind of my take on the Shiny community and the awesome advancements and my hope for a future Shinyverse. I recall using a package from John Kuhn, a good friend of mine, that kind of gave a somewhat scrolly telling look to a web-based presentation, albeit there were some quirks and no fault of his own. It was just the HTML package he was wrapping under the hood. But I do think close read is something I really want to pay attention to, both for some day job tutorials or readouts, but also for some fun narratives too. So I may have to throw my hat in that contest. I don't know. I'm just saying. And there is a lot more resources in the recordings that you'll see on the blog post from Posit. Also, speaking of resources, Posit also, at every PositConf, you also have terrific workshops. And unfortunately, they're not recorded. However, every workshop has made their materials online. And I have been referring back to the workshop that I was attending in person, Databases with R and DuckDB by Kiro Mueller. It was a fantastic workshop. And I'm all in on the DuckDB craze right now, which again, speaking of the recordings, you can hear the keynote from the author of DuckDB in the recording of the PositConf talks as well. Another great development story of DuckDB and where we think the benefits are. And I dare say that we all can benefit from it in my usage of it thus far. So again, lots more to check out. Obviously, I can't do everything justice in this segment here, but I'm really intrigued by catching up on what I wasn't able to attend in person, and lots of great ideas that I think you'll generate in your daily work or your fun adventures with R and data science. We're going to switch gears here to a more automation play story, if you will, albeit a mechanism that I think many in both the open source community as well as in their particular industry day jobs are leveraging, especially in the piece of automation and making sure that we can, release the most robust code possible, say if we're developing packages, or if we want to take away the manual steps of compiling things ourselves, when we can let the magical machines in the cloud do it for us, and that is exposed via GitHub Actions. And if you are new to GitHub Actions and you just want a quick take on what it's actually doing and getting a really, fit for purpose tutorial that you can use today to kind of get your feet wet a little bit and then give yourself the appetite to dive into further, then this next highlight here is just for you. It is authored by a friend of the show, Albert Rapp. He is back again with his 3-Minute Wednesday segment, where he talks about getting up to speed with Quarto, with GitHub Actions for compiling a Quarto document. And this is not going to get in so much the theory behind GitHub Actions. You're not really you're not expected to understand, not that you even have to, kind of what is happening behind the scenes of Actions. But this is about how would you set up a report that you could automatically regenerate whenever you have a change in the repository where this report is hosted, and to be able to automate this more in the future. So the post starts off with creating a new project, in this case in the RStudio IDE, and he is careful to enable two options that you'll need for this, is because this is relying on GitHub after all. You're going to need a Git repository locally for it. And he's also checking rmv as well. rmv is, of course, a package in the R community authored by Kevin Uche at Posit to help you manage the dependencies for your project via its R packages, but in a self-contained way. Usually rmv works really well. I will admit, though, if I was recording this yesterday, I may not have been the biggest fan of it because I had a almost knockout, drag-out fight trying to get my app in production with some dependency HELL that I had to deal with. Somewhat self-inflicted, but nonetheless, sometimes rmv can be slightly cryptic with its messaging. Anyway, things happen, just like anything in life. Nonetheless, that's going to be important for the rest of this tutorial when we get the GitHub action actually created. So the report itself that he's demonstrating here is nothing radical. It's simply a HTML-based report that's going to say that this report was rendered at a time, but this time is printed and executed via a code chunk in Quarto, which will be very familiar to anybody that's used Quarto or Markdown before, just a typical code chunk. With that, you may notice that if you may have initialized rmv, and then when you hit that render report button in Posit, it's going to complain that there are some packages missing. So that's where you do need to install in your rmv library the R packages needed for R execution, which of course are knitter and R markdown. So once you do that with rmv, then you try to render it again, then your local version of the report will compile correctly, and then you can see that depending on when you ran it, that current date time printed right inside. Great, you got yourself a report. Now, let's imagine instead of just using the typical HTML format for the report output, you would like to render this as an actual document in Markdown format, going from Quarto Markdown to Markdown, but in a way that GitHub especially can render that in a nice way. That's using what's called GitHub flavored Markdown. And Quarto itself is a command line utility as well as integrated with various IDEs. So Albert switches and pivots to a new way of rendering the Quarto doc. Instead of through the click button, he now shows you how to use the Quarto render function to render that. And then there's a parameter tac2 to put in GFM for GitHub flavor Markdown. And then he's changing the name of the output file to readme.md. So now you've got a file that can be rendered in a special syntax or special file name. So when you go to the GitHub repository for the project, that readme is going to be what's displayed automatically under the code file listing there. Great. Now we got that working. You can push that on GitHub, and you could just simply run that report occasionally, manually compile it, manually push it up. But no, that's not why we're here. We're going to learn about GitHub Actions. How does this work? So this is interesting because there is a package, of course, called use this that will let you define a GitHub action right away based on a template of like workflows that are pretty typical for an R developer, whether it's package development or R Markdown compilation or whatnot. Albert is going to show you how to build this from the ground up. And I do think this is important because there are times when you're new to a framework, which is an abstraction that, in fact, GitHub Actions are really an abstraction on top of building a container with various bells and whistles to do something. That's really what GitHub Actions are under the hood. And the way you interface with it is constructing a special YAML file that's going to define your workflow. So Albert leads us through with what do we need in our local repository to make this happen. That is, you need a .github folder, and then you need a subdirectory in that called workflows, and this is specific to GitHub here. And then once you have that, then you're going to create a YAML file inside that workflows file. You can name this anything you want, but in the end, it's got to be a YAML file, and it's going to have specific syntax that he's going to walk you through in the rest of this post. Now, it'd be pretty boring for me to read all the bits verbatim here, but I'm going to highlight at a high level the really important parts to make sure that you're setting yourself up for success the right way. First of which is, how do you define when the action is going to be run? In this case, it's going to be run on every push to the main or master branch of the repository, depending on what you call that quote unquote main branch. That's in a certain directive at the beginning under the narrative where you name it. There's this on declarative where you define, okay, on what operations will this operate? In this case, the push operation. From there, below that, then you have the jobs declaration. And this is where you could have one or more jobs, which you can think of are a collection of steps to accomplish a task. So in this case, the task that he's going to call it is render. And each job needs an environment defined for what you're going to run this on. Typically speaking, you want to stick with a Linux-based environment, especially if it's not like a situation where you have to check all multiple OSs. In this case, compile and report. Ubuntu-latest will be your friend for this, because you're not really caring about the version of it. You just want something that can quickly get Quarto up and running and run this report and be on with your way. So that's in the runs on declarative. And then if you want this action to be able to write or commit things on your behalf, you want to make sure to give it the right permissions. And that's in the permissions declarative, where you have to explicitly tell it, I want you to write to this repo. And that's another declarative here. And then the post talks about the different steps. And at a high level, what they are first getting Quarto installed itself, which is done via another GitHub action. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Just like in functions in R, you can run other functions inside of them. You can run other GitHub actions as steps inside your overall GitHub action. And so the Quarto team has generously set up an action for getting Quarto installed. So you really just have to declare it and then define which version of Quarto you want to install, which in this case is the latest version. And in this case, Albert is actually being very explicit with this particular step in the pipeline for installing the R dependencies, where he is simply calling arbitrary code via a bash line calling R script to install packages that he needs to first get RM up and running, and then using RM itself to restore the library. Now, to be transparent, there is an action that'll let you do this as well, or a couple of actions to do this. But it's good to see kind of how you can do this in your own way when you have to do things more custom. I'll get to that in a little bit. But assuming you got the dependencies up and running, now the next step is actually rendering the Quarto document. And that is simply in the run declarative, just like how Albert used the R script in that run declarative to install RM and then run RM restore, you can use this run declarative to run that same Quarto render, the Quarto render function, or I should say command line call, in the exact same way he did earlier in the post. So nothing changes. It's as if you're typing that in the command line. You're just doing it in the GitHub action. And then this part will look a little odd at first if you're not used to it, but then there is this step about, okay, the README has been updated in the action. I need to push this up to the repository so that it can actually render that finished product. And that's where you can run, again, via the run declarative, the various Git commands to tell Git who you are. In this case, you're going to actually define it as a GitHub action bot. You can put anything you want there. And then literally as if you're in Git command line mode, adding the README, committing it with a commit message, and then pushing it up. In order to do that, though, the GitHub action needs to be able to do this on your behalf using your repository secret token. Otherwise, it's going to complain that it's not authorized to do it. So every action step lets you have an ENV or an environment declaration where he's able to say the GitHub token, but not put in the token like string verbatim, to use like this glue-like syntax with the curly brackets to inject that variable from the secrets kind of store, if you will. There is every repository in GitHub Action will have this secrets thing available where you could put almost any environment variable you want that you define ahead of time. But the GitHub token one is there for you free of charge. So that explains that step. And then lastly, you push this YAML file to the repository, and if all goes to plan, your report will render automatically via GitHub Actions. I say if it goes according to plan because I have never once, in all the times I've used GitHub Actions, gotten it right the first time. There's always something that happens, whether I mistype a package name in my dependency installation, or I'm doing something really crazy with bash scripting and I have no idea how to debug it, and then I get that infamous red X in the actions output in the GitHub repo. I've literally went through this yesterday. I was banging my head against the desk almost on this one. So budget a bit of time. You're going to need it. I wish I could sugarcoat it, but I can't. But once you get up and running with it and you get it working, give yourself a pat on the back because that's a major achievement. It really is. So this is scratching the surface of what you can do with GitHub Actions. Even if I joke about the kind of debugging process, when it works, oh goodness, does it save a lot of time. To illustrate that, I'll invite you to check the show notes, where I link into the show notes of the repository that we built for this Shiny app that we're using as a template for a WebAssembly version of a Shiny app going into a clinical submission. I use GitHub Actions quite a bit for this workflow, and the ways I use it are pretty novel to me anyway, because I never done anything this in depth before. I have 3 actions here, one of which is to indeed render a Quarto-based document in multiple formats, both a PDF format and an HTML format for this reviewer guide. And for the HTML format, I want to publish that actually to S3 bucket so that I can render this as a viewable link in the public domain for our reviewers in case they want to see the latest and greatest draft of it without having to download it themselves. So that was a clever thing I was able to hook in there. And being able to render 2 formats, there's a lot of interesting points on that you can check out on the repo. The other action was to actually publish the WebAssembly application compiled and then publish it to Netlify before I knew about GitHub Pages being a first-class citizen for WebAssembly apps. I did Netlify because that's all I knew back then. So there's an action that helps with that. And then also to publish a more standard bundle of this whole project that's going to be used in what we call a transfer to the regulators directly. That's the third action. And in each of these cases, I'm using bash scripts that are sourced in the action itself via a scripts folder. And I won't pretend I'm the best bash scripter out there, but that's another handy thing. If you find yourself adding a whole bunch of commands in that run declarative, you could outsource that to a bash script and then be able to run that on the fly. And so there's some interesting learnings from that as well. So I have done a lot with GitHub Actions. I won't pretend that I'm an expert at all of it, but I do admit they have helped my workflows immensely. And yes, there are versions of this available on other platforms as well. GitLab in particular has their own take on it, what they call GitLab runners. Very similar YAML type syntax. There will be some differences here and there. I believe in Codeberg does this as well. So it's not the automation play, even though GitHub gets the most of the mind share, it's not just strictly related to them. There are many other ways you could implement this as well. So wonderful post by Albert. He gets you up and running quickly. And yes, you'll want to check out the community of resources for the GitHub actions that the Posit team maintains that are many parts of their workflow that you can get from the use this package. There's even GitHub actions for the Shiny Test 2 package to help get the Test a Shiny app with Shiny Test 2 in a GitHub action. There's lots of things you can do here. And I've already blabbered enough about it, but definitely check out the resources. And Albert does a terrific job getting you up and running quickly with a very relatable issue. Love ourselves continuity on this very show even, and we've been talking about that GitHub action that would render a Quarto document. Well, Quarto itself, there are so many things you can do with it, and I do mean many. And one of the features that it carried forward from what you might call the previous generation of Quarto, which has been our Markdown, is the idea of using parameters inside your reports. So that instead of hard coding everything in the body of the report itself and then having to find, modify, replace when you want to change like a parameter value or you want to change like a data set name or a data set variable, you can use parameters in your Quarto report so that you could define those ahead of time, kind of like function arguments, and render a document dynamically injecting those values into the body of the report. And our last highlight is actually a wrap-up kind of follow-up Q&A portion from Nicola Rennie, who was terrific and once again being very generous of her time for the Pharma conference, where she led a workshop on creating parameterized reports with Quarto. And it was a spectacular workshop. We have linked in the show notes the resources from this workshop with the slides as well. So the recordings should be out in a couple months, so you'll be able to watch the recording of it. Yours truly is going to be helping with editing on that, and I can't wait to watch it because I'm going to learn something new, I'm sure. But Nicola's blog post here is getting into some of the questions that they didn't have time to address in that 2 to 3 hour workshop. And I'm going to pick out a few that were nuggets to me, especially in the intersection of what you can do with R itself in the compilation of these parameter reports, and also with Quarto itself. There were some great questions about, well, when you have a function, is it safe to add an argument for, say, the data frame itself? Because she's using, I believe, the Gapminder data set to illustrate the parameterized reports. And she kind of shows the best of both worlds, where maybe in a first version of the function, you're assuming that the Gapminder data is the one loaded, and you're just going to let them put in a parameter for like the continent to summarize in the filter statement. But you could still have that continent as the first parameter, but then have a default argument for data that just happens to be the Gapminder. And in that way, if for some reason you want to change the name of the data frame, you can still do that and be able to leverage all the benefits of the Quarto, parameters and everything like that with that data argument. Speaking of which, in order to evaluate that as an object, if you had like the name of an R object as one of your parameters, you can use the get function in R to basically translate that string of that object name into the object itself and then do whatever you need to do for further processing. She also mentions there was questions about could we use the parameters to generate dynamic tables instead of just plots? And absolutely yes, right? I mean, you could easily create a table with another handy function to be able to have, say, a reactable type structure just as much as a plot. It all depends on you, what you want to define with it. And then there were also questions about her use of the walk function and the map function from the per package as part of this iteration of creating these multiple reports based on different configurations of parameters. The walk function is really used for, it's not so much you care about the output in R itself, you care about what it's doing as a side effect, like creating files, creating images, creating or doing some kind of uploading of a file or whatever. You don't really care about the object coming back from it. It could be invisible for all you care. But if you have iteration where you want to do something with that result, map is the way to go. So there's a nuance there, but once you get the hang of per, it'll hopefully be easy to grasp once you have that. There are some fundamental questions in that. What is the biggest difference between Quarto and R Markdown in this case? Well, again, R Markdown is great. Look, I built so many things of R Markdown, right? You don't have to switch to Quarto if you don't need to. I mean, Quarto is going to, get probably some more utilities added to it. There is a lot of developer resources behind it now, and with its cross-language capability, we're seeing a lot of data science teams really embracing that. But hey, R Markdown is stable. R Markdown is very dependable in the R ecosystem. You're not compelled to switch if you don't have a need to. So don't feel like just because you're seeing all this material, that you have to go away from R Markdown. I mean, it's still very much a fundamental pillar of the R community, in my humble opinion. Another nugget that I didn't know about in respect to, let's say you have a lot of R code in this report and you want to just source or execute that R script itself in your Quarto report. I didn't realize about the parameter called file, where you give it the path to that particular script, and it will basically source that into your execution. And that is pretty handy. That means you could, do a good job of modularizing your code structure instead of having everything in one big, setup chunk, if you will. You could, export that into different scripts and then use them as you need to throughout your report. And there are also great questions about the concept of styling and formatting, such as, do those fancy callout blocks that you get in Quarto that look great in HTML, do they also work in PDF? Well, yes, they can. You just may not be able to do the collapsing stuff because it's a static representation. But Quarto is very careful to make sure that you can get most of the features in each output format. And in the case of interactivity, at least getting static versions of those. And I was able to, learn this earlier this year and last year with that reviewer document that I was making as part of that submissions pilot project. I could use the call out blocks and it looks really darn good in the PDF. Like I'm pretty happy with it. So much so that now we have another work stream about to spin up about using Quarto in more of these submission documents. So I'm really excited for that. But getting those nice enhancements in the style, and of course we're keeping an eye on types as well. It's a great time for those that still have to live in the world of static documents. I think, Quarto's still going to be very helpful for you. And also there are some real nuggets here about how you can generate these multiple reports from the command line. One thing that took me some getting used to, and again, I haven't watched the workshop yet, is that you can have a YAML file with these params defined, like say a default value of them, and that can be fed into the command line version of Quarto render so that you can just feed in that YAML file and then you'll be able to render that document on the fly. But if you want to do this within R, you've got to do a little trick here that I didn't really realize, is that if you have to get these parameters as kind of these key value name pairs, and if that's where in the Quarto render function that the Quarto package itself exposes, the R package, I should say, you have to give it the named list rather than just the YAML file name. And she has this great tip of using the YAML.load_file function from the YAML package. And that way you can just feed that evaluation of that function in the execute parameter itself, instead of you having to manually do like the list, if you will, yourself of those parameters. That is awesome. I'm so glad I learned that tip, because I was dealing with that just recently with a project at work, and I kind of gave up on doing it from the R side of things, but now we can definitely do that. So that just is my quick take on it. There are lots of terrific resources as mentioned that Nicola has shared at the end of the post, some more workshop materials from others, some more blog posts. And like I said, the recording should be up in a month or two, depending on how fast I can get the editing chops on. And I can't wait to watch this one again, because I've literally used Quarto parameterized reports for a pretty fun daytime project where I was able to escape the confines of a PowerPoint and have a dynamically rendered Quarto dashboard, but tailored for each project using parameters. It was awesome once I got it working, and I was like, I've got to be able to push this more into the mainstream of how we communicate these results. So I'm definitely excited to see where this takes us, and another wonderful workshop in the space of parameterized reporting. This is a great companion to another resource we shared in previous episodes from JD Ryan on her workshop on parameterized reports of Quarto. So you got two top-notch instructors from the R community giving you level-up knowledge on Quarto parameterized reports. What a time to be alive, folks. And there is a lot more I could talk about here, but this episode is getting long already, so I'm going to close out the episode here of an additional find that caught my attention when I was perusing this issue here. And in my additional find this week, I'm going to, put a great spotlight on another great post from Steven Sanderson. He has been, a machine almost of some of his great tutorials on the fundamentals of R and data science. And he has this great post, this great guide, if you will, on how you can create lists in R. List is one of the most important object types I have had in my last probably 5-6 years of my day-to-day work, because there's so many creative things you can do with it. A list, for those uninitiated, is simply a collection of other objects in R, but they don't all have to be the same. Unlike a vector, where say if you have a numeric vector, expecting that they're all numeric, but if you have a string in there, it's going to automatically convert it to string the moment it sees one string in there, because they have to be the same type. You can't mix the number and string. So the list is a way around that sort of thing. And plus, the list, you can create as much of a hierarchical structure as you like. And that can be really important, especially some of these more complicated data structures with like digital readouts, digital machines, and we call it digital biomarkers in our line of work. A lot of web data is coming as list type structure from JSON. Being able to know the ways you can create lists, name them, and do various operations with them using either the built-in apply family of functions or the per package. Lots of awesome things you can do with lists. And they are, again, a huge part of my daily workflow. Once you get the hang of them, there are so many things you can do with it. Such as a package I've learned about from our Pharma. I've heard in the grapevine, but I saw a talk about it, about the cards package by Daniel Schoberg and Becca Kraus, where you're creating basically a results type data frame of these different like statistics for a given variable or a set of variables. But these statistics may be different, and some may be a numeric result, and some may actually be more of a character result, especially when you're dealing with model attributes or things like that. Their way around it to mix all these different types of results together is to use, wait for it, a list column inside your data frame. This is awesome, because then you get to have a lot more control and flexibility in what you're doing with these, you might say, wrapper type data frames, and either putting like entire data frames as like a cell value in a list column, or another model fit object, which the Broom package does, that Cards is kind of taking inspiration from. So with the list object, you can do so much stuff. I highly recommend this post to get up and running quickly. So it was great to see this featured in the issue. My goodness, even flying solo here, I realize I've taken a lot of time already. So I'm going to get you on your way here. But with a few items to close out, of course, is the R Weekly project is a community-driven project. We do not have sponsors. We do this all for you in the R community, in the data science community. All we ask is for your help to make sure this is up and running quick, sustainably, and that's via your contribution. So if you see, whether you authored it or someone else authored it, a great resource that should be featured in next week's issue, you just go to rweekly.org. That should be in your bookmarks. If it's not, I dare say, hot take, you should have rweekly in your bookmarks. Hit that little ribbon at the top where it will take you to our draft of the upcoming issue and a way to do a pull request right there in GitHub's web UI. You just need to do a little markdown, folks. All markdown all the time, just like with Quarto. And you can give us that great resource, and the next issue's curator will be glad to review that and merge it in. So we're really, really eager to have your contributions on this very, very important project. We also like to hear from you in terms of this show itself. We have a little contact page linked in the show notes. You can find this handy little web form to fill out. You can also, with a modern podcast app, I really like Podverse and Fountain these days, but many others in the ecosystem, you can send us a fun little boost along the way to give us feedback directly without anybody in the middle, without any corporate overload trying to say, oh, nope, you can't say that. You can be as unfiltered to us as you like. Luckily, all the feedback we get is usually positive. But if I make any fumbles, I always like to hear about that too. And also, you can get in touch with me on social media these days. I'm mostly on Mastodon with my @our_podcast at podcastindex.social account. Also on LinkedIn, you can search my name and you'll find me there saying something usually or responding to other people. I am contemplating getting a Blue Sky account because I am seeing a lot of traction in the R community going to this. But honestly, Mastodon's been pretty nice to me. And I know there's some people wondering, oh, is this replacing Mastodon? No, I don't think so. I think they both can exist, but I think Mastodon has been extremely helpful for me for both my R and data science friends, keeping in touch with them and meeting new friends along the way, as well as my podcasting adventures. So Mastodon is not broken at all. In fact, I'm going to keep going with that as long as I can. And a big shout out to Dan Wilson, speaking of Mastodon. He's the one that maintains the rstats.me server for Mastodon. That's been a great one to follow. And he's been doing a lot of work to keep that up and running. So Dan, your efforts are not going unnoticed for sure. I greatly appreciate what you do for us. Nonetheless, that's going to close up shop here for this episode of our Weekly Highlights. We hope to have Mike back next week, so you don't have to hear me babble all the time. But nonetheless, I hope you have a wonderful week from wherever you are. Again, have fun with your journeys of R and data science, and we will be back with another episode of our Weekly Highlights next week.